I wonder if we could get the people in the far back to maybe move up here, because this is going to be the center of attention for a little while, and then we will move to the tables after that. Would you all mind coming on up so we feel like we're not in church? And
That's right.
There's lots of space. And I'm Peg Herman, and I wanted to welcome you to our NGO's debate, looking at the digital phenomenon that has come into being. I am the director of the Moynihan Institute of Global Affairs, which is part of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. And this particular event is part of the Maxwell School's 90th anniversary celebration. And one of the foci of the 90th celebration is really to look at challenges that face us in the 21st century. And so to some extent, this particular panel is looking at a challenge that is facing civil society organizations in the 21st century. We're going to have a panel discussion, but we also are going to enlist your ideas, because this is an ongoing research and application area for the Moynihan Institute's Transnational NGO initiative. And so we're going to welcome the innovations from both the audience and our panelists today as we move forward in this direction. And I'd like to introduce David Karpf, who's going to be the moderator. He is with the School of Media and Public Affairs at GW. And he has also written in this area, and his research is looking at the impact that internet has on political associations. And he's written a very interesting book on the move on effect, talking about the unexpected transformation of American political associations and advocacy. Dave?
Thank you so much for having us. And Tosca and your team, thank you for organizing this. We have phrased this as a debate, but debate may not actually be the best word for it. I think this is going to essentially be a discussion. We have a team of illustrious panelists who are leading researchers in the field and leading practitioners in the field. And the point of today is that this is not one single well-defined field, that actually what we have is a collection of niches, all of which spring into action when crises like the one in our prompt strikes. So what we're going to spend this first session on is hearing from each of the panelists about their organization and how that organization would respond to the crisis that we've been presented with. And from that, we're going to get a sense of what that organization's niche is, how they see their role, and what their theory of change is. We'll then follow that up with a discussion of how these niches interrelate, where they work well together, and where they conflict. So that's where we're going to start off. We're going to begin with Andrea Koppel from Mercy Corps. Andrea, thank you for joining us. If you can tell us a bit about Mercy Corps and how you would respond to this sort of a crisis.
Sure. Thanks so much, Dave. And I also want to thank the Maxwell School, Tosca, and CSIS for hosting us today. Mercy Corps is a global humanitarian and development NGO. We're in over 40 countries around the world, and our entry point is often through some kind of natural disaster, some kind of emergency, man-made, or an act of God, as they say. And then we try to quickly transition into what we call in our sort of NGO insider language recovery, and then hopefully helping people address the root causes. So what I'd like to say, just in terms of the scenario that we were given, I don't know if everyone has read it, but I guess in a nutshell, there was some kind of a cyclone that hit Myanmar and Bangladesh, and we're 2 months after the fact. There were naturally thousands of people who were affected. The humanitarian response has happened, so you're talking about food, water, short-term shelter, and things of that nature. And I'd like to make 3 points, and this really gets at the heart of the way that Mercy Corps looks at these types of emergencies. The first is that, and keeping in mind we are beyond the immediate disaster, we need the international community to be looking at addressing what caused these disasters in the first place. So we need to be looking beyond humanitarian to the root causes. And you know, the saving lives piece obviously is critically important, and there's some of us here on the stage, that's what they do, and they do it incredibly well. And it's incredibly important to have those humanitarians that do that full time. But the truth is it's a Band-Aid. And when you're talking about natural disasters or conflict, we need solutions, all right? So this is the second point. You know, Raj Shah, until very recently, the USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development chief, liked to say that over the last decade, the international community spent tens of billions of dollars responding to the same emergencies in the same 9 countries, right? Over and over again. I'm guessing most of us in this room have seen the movie Groundhog Day, okay? But it's not funny, right? This isn't a laugh. This is a wake-up call that we need to be looking at building resilience in these communities. What does that mean? It means the ability of people in Bangladesh, of people in Myanmar, of people in Somalia and Ethiopia that know that there's going to be another cyclone or another drought or another natural disaster or another conflict, that they're able to recover more quickly and ideally themselves. And so this is the third point, and that is Mercy Corps' theory of change, which is you need to work with the communities in these affected countries and listen to them. They know what they need. And organizations like World Vision and Mercy Corps that work around the world are able to then connect the dots and help them find the solutions using the private sector, bringing the private sector in there, as well as government. Because the real solution is connecting the civil society, the communities, with government and the private sector. And so what I'd like to say is that it isn't Mercy Corps that is the solution. It's all of the organizations here and beyond. We need to be mobilizing communities. We need the activists. We need the World Bank. We need the IMF. We need those organizations that have leverage with some of these governments that, let's face it, some of them are corrupt. In the case of Bangladesh, you're talking about thousands of people. Why are they affected over and over again? Well, because there's such rapid urbanization in Bangladesh that farmers are being forced to cultivate flood-prone plains. So they're living and farming on low-lying land. Of course, they're going to lose their homes and their livelihoods. So we need to be working with the governments, putting pressure on them to change their policies, and we need to come up with, listening to the communities to come up with some of the solutions that are going to help them as well, other solutions.
Great, thank you. Mark Smith is Senior Director of Humanitarian Emergencies at World Vision Institute. If you can pick up on that and talk about how World Vision fits in, how do you view your niche within that broader set of challenges?
I appreciate that. A lot of what Andrea has said applies to World Vision as well. I would say our entry point would likely be different in the Bangladesh context. World Vision has traditionally been initially a development organization. It got its start doing child sponsorship in countries around the world. So in most of the countries where we work, we've had a long-term presence. And so when an event takes place in Bangladesh, specifically Bangladesh. World Vision has been working in Bangladesh for many years prior to this cyclone. We are working with probably about 5 million people, 1 million children directly that we're working with. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 1,300 staff in Bangladesh prior to the cyclone. So the other thing I would say about World Vision within Bangladesh is that if you were to go and visit the office, you would not really see too many international faces. The staff is almost all Bangladeshi. And so in that sense, it's a staff that knows the country, it knows the context, it has been through these types of events before. And so they're positioned well to respond, given that this is something that affects their country, as Andrea said, on, over and over and over again. So our entry point is probably slightly different than Mercy Corps' entry point, but in terms of the way that you would see us working, Andrea summed it up very well. It's almost exactly the same. When we talk about, the theory of change, given that we're 2 months into the crisis, given that this is a crisis that affects the country on a regular basis, theory of change begins with what is the end goal? What are you wanting to work towards? What is the kind of state that you're wanting to achieve with the communities where you work? And Andrea, again, used the word resilience. It's kind of the buzzword within our industry these days. And you're wanting to increase the resilience of these communities and of these families so that they're better able to withstand the next shock that's going to come along. And resilience covers a wide range of topics. In the humanitarian space, yes, the immediate needs focus around water, sanitation, health, temporary shelter, non-food items, food, things like that. But when you're talking about resilience, you're starting to talk about more than just kind of meeting those immediate needs. You're now starting to talk about infrastructure issues. You're starting to talk about economic issues that allow a family to economically withstand what's going to happen down the road. You're starting to talk about health issues. A healthier family is going to be able to better withstand future shocks. A family that has a steady income, and the number one indicator with respect to a more resilient family is if there is a steady income stream, even in a post-disaster environment. If a family continues to be able to have income coming into the family, even in a post-disaster environment, that family or that community is going to be more resilient. If you're taking a look at infrastructure issues, minor things such as you're repairing a well, can we actually elevate the well so that when a future flood comes along, it does not flood the well? So looking at issues like that. So when we're talking about kind of the recovery phase, we're looking at what do we do in terms of building back better that allows these communities to better withstand the shock that we know is going to come again in the future. It touches on agriculture. It touches, like I said, on infrastructure. It touches on economic development. It touches on families' personal health issues. And so we'd be looking at our work moving beyond kind of that initial phase and addressing these issues. The other thing to kind of, I would just kind of add a couple of thoughts to what Andrea has said. Solutions often are local. If we think that someone in Washington, D.C., or someone in North America, or someone in Europe is in the best position to decide what is best for a community in Bangladesh, those days are long gone. The best solutions have to come from village-identified needs. The local community are stakeholders in this. Who is going to be impacted the most by our actions? It's the people we're attempting to serve. And so they have to be engaged right from the start. Secondly, in engaging them, they have been through this before. This cyclone in Bangladesh is not new. It's happened before. And so they have gone through this before. They've identified previously what some of the issues are. Third, because these cyclones have happened before, there are some very innovative solutions that have already been taking place within the country. And that's where the networking with other organizations within the country, other local NGOs, other international NGOs is very important, and learning from previous events. And so I would say, kind of local is very, very important. The collaboration, the consortium work, extremely important. And then our theory of change would start with this idea that we are wanting to build more resilient communities that are better able to withstand future shocks.
Let me ask one clarifying question.
Yes.
When you talk about local being important and you listed a large number of things that they could do to build resiliency.
Right.
For both of your organizations, do you select a high priority thing that can help this community, or do you build a space where they deliberate over that and choose themselves? How, in a granular level, how do you help them decide how they should respond?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, clearly, we are organizations that have experience in terms of working in these environments. So we do have some ideas with respect to solutions. If they are imposed, they will not be accepted. If they're not owned by the local community, they will not be accepted. So in many ways, the ideas, the thoughts, have to be owned by the community. They have to really kind of, they may be in a better position to identify needs. We can come along with possible solutions, and then from there, it's a collaborative effort.
Great. Let's turn now to Blair Glencourse. Blair, you're the founder and executive director of Accountability Lab. Tell us about Accountability Lab and how it would fit into a scenario like this.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone again for having us here. The Accountability Lab is an incubator for creative tools and ideas and communities around the issue of accountability and integrity and anti-corruption. So we work in various contexts across West Africa and South Asia to find people with these good ideas and support them in various ways to build out those ideas and make them sustainable, to make people in power responsible for decisions. So with that in mind, the way that I would look at this situation is from an accountability perspective. How can we make sure before these disasters happen, but also after they've happened, that people who are entrusted to make decisions carry out those decisions in a way that is citizen-centric and that builds trust to make sure that these things don't happen again. And I think trust would really be at the heart of my theory of change for how we would deal with these kinds of things. If we can create feedback loops that build trust between citizens and people in power and back down again, then we can begin to get to a situation where, over time, we can deal with this kind of thing. And there's something called the Edelman Trust Index that is released every year, and it showed this year that trust in institutions of all types is lower than it's ever been, but particularly trust in governments is as low as it's ever been. And of course, that is pushed to breaking point in situations of crisis like this. And so the first point would be, I think, that we need to think carefully about who we work with in these kind of situations, to what extent we support governments to respond to some of these crises. And I haven't been to either of these countries. We do work in South Asia, but not in Bangladesh or Myanmar. But the government in these places is not trusted by a significant proportion of the population. So in response to this, how do we think about who can deliver aid and in what ways? And I would argue that in many cases, international organizations aren't actually any more trusted than governments. So that piece of it, I think, is important, and there's no easy answer. The second bit of it from an accountability perspective is corruption. It's now about $2.6 trillion a year, as far as we can estimate these things, which is about 17 times more than the entire amount of overseas aid that we provide every year. And of course, in these kinds of emergency contexts, the opportunity for corruption is much greater because we're in a hurry. We want to respond as quickly as we can. And the piece there, and we do a lot of work in Liberia, and it's something that Robtel and I have talked about and written about, is we have to make sure that there are systems in place to monitor where this money is going. In Liberia, during the Ebola crisis, it's been very difficult. Even the best efforts of local organizations and international organizations, even within their own groupings, within the US government, for example, there are lots of different agencies that have given money to the Ebola response, but none of them know how much that is, and it's extremely hard to coordinate, and when it's not coordinated, it's hard to track. So we have to look at how we can support local organizations in particular to monitor where money is going. And in Liberia recently, I've spoken to a lot of citizens about this, and of course they're primarily concerned about their own safety and health, but the second question or issue that they tend to bring up when we're talking to them is, we want to know where the money's going. It's being spent in our name, where is it? So that piece of this is key. And it relates to the third point, which is that our response has to be citizen-centric. It has to be about the people and understanding how we can support them to do what they can do and often have experience doing, rather than what we as internationals think might work or has worked in other contexts. And that's about making citizens what we call makers and shakers, rather than users and reactors. So it's giving them the sense that they're able to respond in the right kind of ways, and that they have the tools and communities to do that. They're not just users of tools that we provide, and they're not just reactors to information that we give them. And I think that's about meeting them where they are, not just where we want them to be. So finding who has trusted voices in society and who can deliver messages in the right kind of ways. It might be religious institutions, it might be musicians, it can be all sorts of people, but I think we need to be creative about that, because our international voice isn't always trusted and can't deliver the messages in the right kind of ways for them to resonate. And that also relates to the kind of high and low tech perspective on this. I think there are plenty of high tech tools that work and that can be used in these kinds of contexts, but there are tons of so-called low-tech tools that have often been used for many years that are actually better in terms of getting messages to people, whether it's radio, whether it's mural campaigns, whether it's community meetings, and so on. A fourth point would be that this is a long-term endeavor. The organizations that are trusted are the ones that have been there for a long time, which tend to be local organizations. So to prevent these kind of crises, I think we need to work with those types of groups, but we also need to understand that responding to a crisis is not a question of coming in for 6 months and then leaving. And that's been a massive issue in Liberia around Ebola too. As soon as it got bad, the perception was that all of the internationals left, which was largely true. And again, that undermines trust over time if we're talking about the longer process of development. In Haiti, the earthquake 5 years ago that you all know very well about, I was looking at this recently because it's been just been the 5th year anniversary. And there are still 85,000 people in tented camps in Haiti, 60% of whom say that the conditions were better directly after the earthquake than they are now. And if that's the case, I think we really need to look at how we're dealing with these kinds of situations. And the related point there is that I looked at all of the USAID funding to Haiti after the earthquake, and about 0.6% of that funding actually went to Haitian civil society organizations. So we talk about capacity building, but in practice we don't channel funding in ways that actually builds capacity, and then that allows us to justify continuing to duplicate that capacity with expensive international consultants. And so I wonder if we can begin to, as part of this session, reimagine the way that we conceptualize the problem of emergency response, not just the specifics of the way that the system works currently. And then finally, that relates to a point that Andrea, I think, made at the beginning about this being a learning process. The case study points out very clearly that this has happened time and time again. Why are we collectively and in reality in these places always coming together and relearning the same processes, the same lessons from last time? There's been a lot documented around these kinds of disasters. How do we make sure that our response going forwards is about adaptive learning, and that success is measured not just as a specific point in time, whether a certain amount of people have certain needs met, but also about how much we've learned about that process and what we can integrate from that learning into what we do going forwards.
Let me pin down one procedural question. That's a large and thick theory of change. What do you do first as Accountability Lab?
We listen. We spent about a year before we did anything just listening to people. And we weren't in emergency situations, so we had the luxury of taking that time. But I think unless you really listen and understand what people are telling you and ask questions that get to the heart of some of the challenges that they face.
You listen by being on the ground there?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And then you can build a theory of change and potentially build a set of programs that can support what it is that those people would like to do.
Great, thank you. Next, we're going to turn to Michael Silverman. Michael runs Greenpeace Accountability Lab.
Mobilization Lab.
What's that?
Mobilization.
Mobilization. Yes, Greenpeace Mobilization Lab. This is what happens when you know the guy long enough that you think, I don't need to look at my notes. Talk to us about how Greenpeace would interact with a crisis. I mean, you're not a crisis response organization per se. How does a Greenpeace fit into this picture?
Sure, yeah, so Greenpeace is among, if not the largest independent campaigning organizations in the world. So we are much more of a campaigning group than a response group, but increasingly response is part of effective campaigning, responding to moments like these. And I'll just say I come from a part of Greenpeace that is the mobilization lab that kind of orbits the global organization to support our transition to a new era of campaigning. Greenpeace grew up about 40 plus years ago, in a world where we didn't have the internet and we didn't have a world where anyone could find ways to potentially respond to a situation such as this. So we are working with the staff and our allies and colleagues to figure out how do we open up our campaigns in new ways and start designing campaigns in new participatory ways that enable us to scale the impact we're having. So part of the transition that Greenpeace is going through is trying to figure out how we set ourselves up in the 30 different national and regional areas that we work in to reflect some of the values you've just heard. So in this case, we don't have an office in Bangladesh. So this is a very interesting challenge to a new structure in which offices are meant to lead. So rather than having an international body, as I think you said, Mark, or an office in Amsterdam, as we have, who would suddenly come up with the answers about what needs to happen in Bangladesh, very far from the front lines of a crisis or environmental scenario. In our case, we would look towards an impacted office to lead, which normally is what happens, whether it's street protest in Turkey or something else. In this case, I don't know the answer to how our global team would figure out how to coordinate, if not deferring to Greenpeace India in our case. So that's an interesting, if we want to get more into internal structures, we could. But I'm sure our response would involve a close collaboration between Greenpeace India and a global team of campaigners as part of this new distributed campaigning model. So that's on the process. In terms of the tactics and how we would approach this, given what you said, Dave, the first thing we would do is actually probably follow and look at what are humanitarian aid groups internationally or locally doing, and figuring out what are the ways we can just be useful to the most immediate needs and crisis. One of the things we have is, surprisingly or not, is a lot of boats, and so that we typically find ourselves helping out. We have huge warehouses in almost every office with all kinds of inflatables, and we have 3 ships around the world that can be very useful when trying to rescue people from homes, or we had when there was the BP Horizon spill, we had some of the first aerial and on-site photography bearing witness to what was actually happening because of the kind of logistics operation that Greenpeace has. But we are not an aid organization, so we would certainly follow and figure out where can we help. And then once the immediate, moving into kind of a second phase, we would then see this as there's a massive campaigning opportunity here, right? And I use opportunity in the positive sense. It is, as the scenario indicated, this is clearly a climate-related event. So how do we figure out, the question would then become, how do we figure out how to move the issue forward? How do we use this moment? And especially we've been studying more and more how moments of instability actually become opportunities for massive step change, right? So we would seize on this opportunity perhaps even more than another kind of campaign that you design in a vacuum without real-world context that you can hook onto. And so while I don't have any specific examples from Bangladesh, we do have recent typhoon and climate weather disasters that we can look at. And certainly in Southeast Asia, there have been a number of recent ones. There are two examples that I think are relevant that we would probably put back on the table in this scenario. And both kind of highlight this theme we're starting to hear, I guess, about community-led solutions and campaigning with people, which is a priority for Greenpeace. So, rather than cooking up, and I guess it's part of a larger societal trend towards design thinking and putting people at the center of solutions, rather than cooking up our own ideas in a small room, imagining that they'll work for everyone. So the two that come to mind are both from the Philippines in following the recent, I think it was Typhoon Hagapit, and one was looking at some solar solutions for communities that were devastated and either no longer had power or perhaps never had power in the first place. We're increasingly working with communities to implement, and local partners to implement solar solutions or solar power in these places that demonstrate what a energy revolution looks like, what non-carbon intensive energy development looks like. And so that's one example. And then the other is around, I think someone else mentioned, or Andrew, you were talking about crops. And I think it'd be interesting to talk more about the similarities here. But we also noticed that farmers were suddenly, communities were wiped out in terms of their ability to grow the crops they normally do. So we, at Greenpeace there, worked with local farmers to initiate or participate in a seed swap from other parts of the country to help impacted farmers and communities start planting a more diverse set of crops that are more climate resistant and resilient and are also less carbon intensive. So as opposed to the more carbon intensive kind of monocultures that many of the larger corporate agriculture companies, I think you were talking about this too, will also use these opportunities to insert themselves with. So, and of course, in both scenarios, it's an opportunity to be building longer-term power by working with communities on solutions that not only meet immediate needs, but also connect them to the larger issues long-term.
Let me focus in on one thing.
Yeah.
You mentioned that there's this second phase where you view it as a massive campaigning opportunity. And I think that's important to know, like, in the moment you're responding to the crisis and then you switch to that second phase. How do you know when that second phase has arrived?
Great question. I don't know. I think it has to do with a lot of listening as well, and it's not just a media cycle question, but it's also are there people in unable to meet basic needs right now? This is just, I think, whether it's a gut feeling or just two people using good judgment to say, okay, the people we are trying to work with or serve are unable to think, in terms of next week and getting crops in place because they still don't have, food and shelter. I think once that phase, or we're still looking for bodies at that point, once that initial phase has passed and it's clear that we're no longer in, I don't even have all the appropriate terminology, but disaster response, I suppose, the first phase of disaster response, then it seems like that's when we typically will start talking about, okay, what's the phase two?
So it's a type of listening, but it sounds like, tell me if I'm right about this, it's a listening that, like, you're not in the communities listening to them, you're watching news cycles, seeing how the news cycle changes, talking with a set of skilled campaigners about at what point does our gut tell us it's now appropriate to make this shift. Is that right?
Yes, but I would also say before all that is just talking to allies and partners who are more experienced than we are on that phase of work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So allies and partners who are on the ground there.
Exactly, especially in this case, for example, when we are not. If we are in a country, that gives us, I think we have a better sense of what's appropriate when we have our own, when we have staff and volunteers there.
Great.
The other thing that I think gets tricky about knowing when the phase changes is when we're thinking about the rest of the global organization. So the examples I gave were very much kind of country-specific solution, the solar and the seed swap. Those are not things that, say, a global constituency of 30 million people around the world can necessarily contribute to as well. There are ways, certainly, but then there becomes a question about how do we connect a global constituency to this issue that's quite local and quite far away, perhaps, from other people, from where the majority of the world is living. And so one of the things so there's constantly a new brainstorm, a new approach, new thinking about how do we look at this as a global campaigning opportunity or a moment to leverage, and something that connects to what Blair was talking about is the question of climate liability. So we are also known for a lot of corporate campaigning. So our targets can be governments, but increasingly and there are many political targets we work on, but also many corporate targets increasingly. And in a scenario like this, we have been and would continue to have a very real conversation about what kind of liability could we assign to this typhoon. For example, is there negligence of some kind that some of the carbon majors or the major oil companies could be held responsible for? That's something that can translate into perhaps illegal. There's a lot of interesting dialogue about how do we turn that. Is there actual legal liability there for some of the damage? Is there a social license campaigning opportunity? For example, do we need to change the narrative in the way the media is talking about this? Do we need to even potentially rename this storm instead of a typhoon whatever, that it's a typhoon shell or something like that, and to help shift the way we think about who's responsible for these kinds of climate-related disasters.
Okay, great, thank you. So now we have two academics who aren't representing specific organizations. Robotel, you are an academic, you are an activist, you are an author. Based on your research and your experience, what should we be looking for and what should we expect from a situation like this?
Sure. I think I'd like to sort of bring it back to the scenario. I think the issue here really is that there are vast numbers of people who've been displaced and they're unwilling to move back to areas where the typhoon or the cyclone took place. So the problematic really is, what do you do with people who are justifiably concerned about their livelihoods being threatened as a result of this mass population shifts? And I think for me, one of the takeaways, or an important point to remember from the very beginning, is that this situation is not a tabula rasa situation. It's not a blank slate. Other panelists have mentioned this, but it's an important point to continuously reiterate that this is an experience that's happened before. And I think that moves me to my next point, in that there's a particular technique in conflict transformation called appreciative inquiry, which basically means that you look at a situation that may be incredibly challenged, but you think about what's working that can be built upon. What's positive that's come out of the situation that can be built upon. And so I did a little bit of digging, because I'm not familiar with Bangladesh nor Myanmar in terms of that regional expertise. But I found out that Bangladesh has actually done a fantastic job of investing in social protection mechanisms for citizens. So about 40% of their 2012 budget went to social assistance programs for citizens, and 12% of that 40% went to particularly disaster relief. So this isn't something that the government was completely unaware of or unprepared for. This is an investment that's been going into the country for a very, very long period of time. Bangladesh also has a Ministry of National Disasters and Relief. And so I would say that organizations, the first thing you need to sort of question is what government organizations or what government programs would actually support these displaced people that are already there in terms of institutional backup. I also found out that Bangladesh has let me look at the stats, a housing repair scheme that basically gives a one-off housing repair for anyone who has had some sort of interaction with a natural disaster. And their housing is able to be repaired on a one-term basis. And so looking at that scheme, the question I would ask is, has that scheme come into effect in this particular scenario? Are people given an opportunity to choose a scheme to build houses that have been wiped out? Or can the scheme be tweaked in such a way that you're giving them an opportunity to build a new house in a different location? So again, not tabula rasa, an institution such as the Ministry of Disaster Relief is already in place in the government structure as a social assistance mechanism to respond to this kind of crisis. I think the other thing I would also say as a researcher is that even learning from the Ebola crisis in Liberia, where I'm from, is that organizations often work in silos, and that's incredibly unhelpful for crisis management processes. And so what I would say is that it's important for organizations to get a sense of where the authority rests, because authority in some ways may not necessarily be with the government. It may not necessarily even be with community structures. It may be with diaspora organizations. I've done a lot of work on diaspora engagement and transnational relief efforts. One of the things I was really proud to see was Liberians in the diaspora responded much faster than international organizations. It was 6 months after the actual Ebola crisis had been declared an international healthcare emergency that international actors started pledging support and then also dispersing, because quite often there's a long road between commitment and cash in terms of the dispersals. And so looking at diaspora organizations as sort of a locus of authority and saying, how can they convince their local constituents on the ground to not only move from places that might have disaster consequences for the future, but also moving to locations that they may not necessarily feel they're embedded in, and convincing them that that's a better solution, given that diasporas tend to have sometimes much more influence than governments do, or sometimes tend to have more influence than international organizations do, even if they've been working in these countries for long periods of time. So I think that's a particular locus of authority that hasn't been mentioned, and I would insert that and say diaspora transnational relief, and even NGO. So you've got hometown associations that work on the ground that are funded primarily by diaspora actors outside of the countries. I think another important node of authority that we haven't really talked about is the work of researchers. So in the Liberia case, there was a call for social scientists to get involved in the relief efforts because social scientists such as anthropologists had worked in these particular communities for long periods of time as researchers. And so they understood intimate cultural, political, socioeconomic practices that international actors didn't have privy or weren't privy to. And I'd say in this particular instance, it's important to engage the work of researchers, whether they be anthropologists or political scientists, who've worked in these communities, to get a sense of what their needs are and why they're concerned about moving back to the regions where they've left. I think another important sort of locus of authority or node of authority that hasn't been mentioned is multilateral organizations such as the Asian Development Bank that has been funding disaster relief and climate change programs in Bangladesh and Myanmar for a long period of time. The Asian Development Bank has actually set up a social protection index where they measure the investment that Asian and Pacific countries have made in social protection as sort of an advocacy mechanism to increase social protection and social assistance and social insurance programs for these countries in the case of sort of disaster relief. I would say I think another thing that's really important in terms of the response is to also get a sense of sort of an advocacy tool. In the literature on environmental refugees, there's almost a tension or a tussle between those who are staunchly opposed to including environmental migrants in the definition of refugees, such as the UNHCR, because it would mean more funding. And UNHCR is already stretched thin as a result of the mass influx or mass exodus of people outside of their countries of origin. There's a specific 1951 convention, a refugee convention, that said a refugee is only someone who has experienced some sort of persecution as a result of social qualifiers such as race, gender, religion, so forth and so on. And so UNHCR as an institution is very concerned about expanding that definition. But if you look at an organization like the International Organization of Migration, they've actually come up with a very clear-cut definition about what an environmental migrant is. So in terms of advocacy, I think NGOs in the long term would probably start having a conversation with these international multilateral organizations about expanding the definition of refugees so that they actually have legal protection under the law in terms of crisis. So if they've lost their homes, that they can get some sort of care package, or they have a legal status so that they can actually cross borders and go to a different country. Myanmar and Bangladesh actually share a border, but they might want to travel to India. Perhaps they have family members there and set up shop there for a short period of time before moving back when the disaster has been resolved. So increasing the legal protection of these people, I think, is important. And expanding the definition from sort of refugee, but also environmental migrants as being legitimate in terms of their rights and their access to legal protection. So I'd say those are the things that I would say are incredibly important.
Let me ask you one pointed question. Based on your observations in Liberia, what would you say is the biggest mistake that the transnational NGO community made in Liberia that you would hope wouldn't be replicated in this scenario?
I think the first mistake, and it got perpetuated in media reports, was that people didn't know what to do, that they were completely at a loss about how to respond and how to save themselves from the crisis. And the evidence on the ground is actually the opposite of that. People responded in ways that were completely and just utterly ingenious. They came up with solutions that were short-term. They came up with solutions through their own ingenuity in terms of bringing down the infection rates, in terms of contact tracing, in terms of mobilizing funds, again, from relatives abroad, but also sort of cross-continentally, that I thought that narrative isn't necessarily something that we hear enough of. That people on the ground have the solutions, and this has already been said. It's just a matter of supporting those initiatives and ensuring that they're legitimized.
So if I can make sure that I'm right about this, often NGOs are driven, particularly transnationally, internationally, to present a crisis narrative. There's a crisis and we need to go save them now. What you would like to see more often is identification of the positive and ingenious work that's being done on the ground and surfacing that and reporting that out early on.
Sure, and that's where the appreciative inquiry comes in, is
Right.
what's going well in a very, very difficult situation and how do we build on that?
That's great, thank you. I'm going to turn now to my colleague, Steve Livingston. Steve, you study information communication technologies in what you term areas of limited statehood. We've heard from a number of existing organizations so far. I'm curious, two things. One, from your research, what do you consider to be sort of missing from this lineup? And two, the title of this panel is Breaking Digital. What would you say breaking digital means in this context?
Thank you, Dave. It's good to see you here. I think that's a great question. Breaking digital often means different things in different parts of the world. I think most often when we study social movements and NGOs in the global north, we immediately think of Twitter and Facebook, et cetera, the go-to places where people network and mobilize their initiatives. But when you go to places elsewhere in the world, including where our scenario takes place, you find a considerably different lineup of tools, technologies, and key players that I think should be called to mind here. Some of them are rather esoteric. So going digital means turning to digital technologies to seek out the efficiencies that they provide an organization, or, as the research literature sometimes says, even constituting in and of themselves a form of organization built on the platform. So what kinds of platforms am I talking about? Well, first of all, there's something that's very, very important, certainly in Africa, but elsewhere in the world, frontline SMS, which is essentially a platform that allows for the creation of the equivalent of a local area network, but built on the back of mobile telephony, rather than broadband internet connectivity, for the simple fact that broadband internet connectivity is often missing in the parts of the world where these kinds of crises take place. So when we think about how to respond to a crisis like this, how to mobilize communities, how to empower citizens, how to encourage accountability, it's often going to be built on the back of a mobile phone network. Mm-hmm. And as we know, in the world today, there are about 7 billion mobile phone subscriptions. Now that isn't a one-to-one ratio between users and phones. There's sometimes, in some instances, 3 subscriptions to one person. In other instances, several people may share the same phone, but 7 billion phones. Another technology that I would fit under the umbrella of going digital would be high-resolution remote sensing satellite imagery that's provided by commercial firms, not by states, but by commercial firms. Google is in this business these days, but then, of course, Google is in all kinds of businesses. But Google has a fleet of satellites that it's putting in orbit that will allow for high-resolution imagery on a consistent or constant basis because of the sheer number of satellites that we're talking about. This allows people in a crisis situation where having a high temporal resolution is important. In other words, going back to that place on a consistent basis is an important part of monitoring the response. Having satellites in space that you can turn to that allow for a consistent monitoring of the conditions on the ground from space at a resolution that's approximately about the size of this, a little bit bigger in the case of the Google satellites, this size. In the case of a digital globe, EarthView 3 satellite that's just gone into orbit, it's a 12-inch resolution in the panchromatic scale. In other words, black and white imagery that's no bigger than that. So you can find out a lot about an ongoing situation if you have available to you that sort of geospatial information, not only images, but the other kinds of benefits, the other kinds of data that come about from that sort of capability. You then start layering on top of that open source geographical information system platforms such as Ushahidi. I think that probably many of us have heard of, if not used, Ushahidi in this room, but Ushahidi presupposes that sort of geo-rectified, very precise kinds of data that you get from commercial remote sensing satellite imagery. And then with Ushahidi, this opens up all kinds of things. It opens up the possibility of crisis mapping. There's something called the Emergency Standby Task Force that utilizes the ability of networking people together to be involved directly on a global scale in response to a crisis like this. And it keeps going. You know, you establish Twitter feeds, you establish hashtags and all of that. Stepping back away from the geospatial stuff for a while, just thinking in terms of digital diasporas. You know, this is an important thing. Now, I'm not quite sure that this was the case in Liberia, but with disasters in places where M-Pesa or the equivalent of M-Pesa is in place, you're empowering the diaspora to contribute directly to the funding of a relief effort. M-Pesa is a mostly Kenya-based money transfer system that's rooted entirely on mobile telephony. It's not a cell phone, or it's not a credit card-based system. So when I think of what it means to be breaking digital, as opposed to breaking bad, that's another story. But breaking digital means that you are able to leverage the technologies that are available on a global scale to fill in what Andrea began to talk about with respect to resilience. As Dave said, in my line of research, I call that governance. Governance capacity, the capacity of a community, whether it's through the state or through NGOs, to address the pressing needs of a community. And the key for breaking digital is that it facilitates efficiencies or affordances that otherwise would be difficult, if not impossible, to achieve through conventional means.
One follow-up question. We've heard from a number of the previous presenters about listening being the first step. How do these new digital tools fit in with listening?
Great question. So, you know, I made reference to the Emergency Standby Task Force. You can Google it if you're not familiar with it, but it's the idea that there is a global community of responders who are in the business of connecting together the digital output of people who find themselves in crises, whether it be tweets, text messages, all the rest. A good example of this is with respect to the response to Haiti, the earthquake in Haiti, where a lot of this emerged. Listening in this instance means the ability to listen, to pay attention to organize and respond to the digital traffic that's coming out of the affected community itself. And again, that may come in the form of SMS messages, it may come in the form of tweets, other sources of data, including now these days, as I said, remote sensing data. Even people like Patrick Meyer are getting involved in how to use drones, or as he prefers to call them, unmanned aerial vehicles, in a crisis situation to get a real-time assessment of conditions on the ground, crowdsource the assessment of the images to a global community who can look and observe and categorize the output. That's a form of listening that's very different than going into a community and sitting and listening. That's important too. But the sheer scale of being able to do this in digital technology is the key difference between a very important part of listening with one's ears and face-to-face conversation with being able to crowdsource and utilize big data that's emerging from these crises.
Great, thank you. Jason Cohen is the Communications Director of Doctors Without Borders. Also, I believe, a documentarian.
A little bit, yeah.
It's 2 months after the crisis. What is Doctors Without Borders' role now? What are you best at?
You mean in terms of the case study? Yeah.
In terms of the case, yeah.
Yeah, well, very much. I mean, we're an emergency response organization. Most of our work is done in conflict zones. About 50% of our programs are in unstable environments, war zones, the Yemens, the Afghanistans, the Syrias, and very much focused on an emergency medical response. The other programs are really in sort of epidemic response. Sometimes they're longer-term diseases like AIDS and drug-resistant TB. But the bulk of our work is in those areas of instability, and we're coming in, obviously, in an emergency and very cognizant, as in the case study, that most of the time in these crises, you're exacerbating pre-existing power dynamics that exist and exposing even greater vulnerabilities, in this case, sort of, the internally displaced people in this scenario. And we're very cognizant of those things. And I think it's very important when we think about the 2 months after the emergency response. We don't get into sort of the long-term capacity building. We don't feel like that's our area of expertise. We're actually quite concerned about the level of response capacity in those first 2 months from an international standpoint, and that it's nowhere where it needs to be, and that these are situations in which communities, no matter how resilient, and these are very resilient communities. I mean, you look at South Sudan, you have some communities didn't get aid for 3 months after the restart of the civil war. So they're tough. These people are tough. They're a lot tougher, actually, than the people who work for us. And they have to deal with very difficult situations. So I think in this case, where we would come from and what the perspective we would look at is really what are the needs of these displaced people? Where, what is their trying to return a sense of autonomy and choice as much as possible, right? In a situation where they've lost that ability to do that, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's the very reasons why they may have had to settle and farm in those particular areas in this case study. And so it would be, and this is the case obviously, and you pointed up a really interesting point about sort of the definitions of what it means to be internally displaced people, how international humanitarian law sort of plays into that, what rights and responsibilities do states have towards people like this. So let's say in the absence of a UNHCR or an IM stepping in, MSF in that case, we would step a bit further out of our sort of remit to try and understand what are the situations for these people. Where are the areas that they're being asked to return to? What's the conditions there? Do they have access to water, to shelter, to medical care? Are those sufficient? Are they insufficient in terms of quality and quantity? If they weren't, we would absolutely, I think, advocate probably at either at a local, state, provincial, national level. If it requires so, we would engage multilateral institutions, whether it be various UN agencies. If we feel like that they're not stepping up to their responsibilities, we'd probably confront them bilaterally, and if not respond, we would do that in a public fashion, but really sort of taking that trajectory. I think in terms of the concepts of using sort of digital technologies in the spaces, we'd be very, we're pretty pragmatic in that sense. Where the opportunities exist, we take advantage of them, but we very much see them as tools that facilitate a response, whether it be emergency, whether it's exposing and shedding light on some of these underlying issues that come up. So, and we would do it very much from a medical standpoint. We sometimes carry out epidemiological surveys about mortality rates, in terms of deaths under 5, looking at malnutrition rates, everything from just even counting the amount of latrines that are available, using the so-called CSIS standards that we use in humanitarian practice. So for us, it would be really sort of establishing what is the baseline, right? And reinforcing the fact that as an international organization, we're hopefully coming in this a little bit removed. I mean, that's the point of our intervention, is somewhat trying to stay above the fray of the pre-existing politics that exist, knowing that we have to be very cognizant of them at the same time, and that we must operate within them. All the situations that are listed here, we essentially responded to at different points. I think we would recognize that there are very much long-standing sort of Groundhog Day-ish scenarios, but we would also sort of, I think, come on to the point, and this is where I would enter a bit into the concept of a sort of debate, is that, resilience as a terminology is very much a buzzword in the field that we work in and a lot of my other colleagues work in. It's interesting because I think resilience in its concept is really a system's ability to respond back to its stasis or its former state. We're talking about countries typically where we operate in, where governments are failing to meet their commitments. If we talk about the response to Hurricane Sandy, we don't expect that people in New Jersey, or we don't expect the communities that were affected in Staten Island and such to bounce back immediately. There are insurance schemes, there are expectations of governance, there's many things that come into play. And what I tend to worry about, and this is more of a personal as opposed to sort of an organizational priority, is that, how do the expectations we put on of communities who are arguably incredibly resilient, day in and day out, they're impoverished, they're in situations of either conflict or environmental disasters. They've shown the capacity to live and it's not necessarily thrive, obviously, but operate in environments where they're often discriminated against, either legally or informally. The power dynamics are in many ways against them. And so how do we, I think, as aid agencies in this case, sure, absolutely give them tools, but not give them those tools that reinforce the same failings that existed and have created the underlying reasons for their vulnerability. And I think there's an important point there. If we look at Haiti and we look at the earthquake, and we also noted sort of how people feel about the IDP situation. If we look at the cholera case, the conditions that existed in 2010 Haiti were basically ostensibly similar to what you found in the early 1800s in New York City when a cholera outbreak thrived at that period of time. And that's really the absence of really systems that we would all expect in our own communities, the donor countries expect. Those things would be invested on. Water and sanitation, basic health care. Those things weren't there before the earthquake. They're certainly not after. So I think it's important, even though we acknowledge that resilience is an important concept in and of itself, is that whether it's in this case study here in Bangladesh or it's somewhere else, is that the aid response doesn't reinforce the very things that created the disaster from the outset. I think that's very important in terms of when we think about concepts of accountability, as you were talking about, and the roles that different people can play in this. We stink at accountability towards beneficiaries as organizations. I will say that as MSF, I think we have a lot of work to do as our own. We're really good about being accountable to the people who give us the money to do our work. We give them lots of nice reports. We listen to them very well. We're highly responsive. We're not that good when it comes to beneficiaries, and we need to find other ways. Technology is probably a very interesting way to make sure that happens, either in a leverage from the communities we're responding to, forcing us to be more accountable, or on our own accountable sort of levels, trying to do it on our own. So I think there's definitely a lot of opportunities there. I think I'll just kind of leave it at that, but I think the response really depends in this case study, I think, on a lot understanding the environment in which we operate in, and making sure that at the end of the day, we're assisting the people that came there at the outset, not reinforcing the structures that were oppressive to them at the outset.
So let me ask you one augmenting question. Who are you, within the TNGO community, who are your closest allies? Who are the organizations that you consider fellow travelers that you're likely to be in the same room with or coordinating strategy?
Well, I'll give you an example of the Ebola crisis. We mobilized a lot of resources for that. We very quickly realized that the emergency was much bigger than we were able to do. We opened up our training centers to organizations like the International Medical Corps, to other organizations, even to CDC trainers. And that was really from an ethos of trying to enable a response. We're not built as an organization to train and support and capacity build for others. We tried to do it. We did as best as we could. There are also in the transition, this very important gap between emergency and sort of post-emergency, and it's the area when we oftentimes are handing over or leaving situations, so we can use those resources in other emergencies. Yeah, we're handing over to other organizations who are going to stay in that phase, who are working longer term on that. And typically it depends really on the capacities. If we're running a very medicalized program, we're going to have to work for the medical organization. It could be IRC, it could be Mercy Corps, it could be any one of these if it's work in primary health care level and in a refugee camp as well. It's really kind of needs-driven and dependent rather than necessarily presupposing. We're all, I think, can admit that our programs in some countries are better than others, and we feel confidence about the coordination teams we have and their ability to hand over certain levels of responsibility depending on the mission countries. So.
Great, thanks. Let's turn to Ben Wickler now. Ben, you are the Washington Director of MoveOn.org, also the host of an excellent podcast that I listen to called The Good Fight with Ben Wickler. You've also been at Avaz.org and you've been at Change.org. Talk to us about how one of those types of organizations is going to approach this crisis, what you're going to look to do, what you're going to look to contribute.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, excuse me. Thanks to the organizers today, and thanks to my fellow panelists. It's been fascinating hearing each of your perspectives. I'm excited about our discussion. So I'll speak for MoveOn via Avaz in a way that will become clear in a moment. But I'll say at the outset that the kinds of organizations that I work with are almost like upside-down versions of what you guys do. So MoveOn has 8 million members and 25 staff. And member means person who gets our emails. Does anyone here get email from MoveOn.org? Not enough email or too much email? I'm not going to ask that. Does anyone here get emails from Avaz.org? Great. Change.org? Great. So I've sent you all a lot of email. over the years. Thanks for not unsubscribing, maybe. The way that we operate is that we, on the staff of these groups, we consider ourselves servants of our members, of our subscribers. And our job is to look for ways that we can help our members have an effect on the world that they believe in. So step one is figuring out what do our subscribers care about? And we run polls all the time of our members asking them, what are their priorities? We look at messages that they send us. We monitor our social media channels. They're the first group of people we listen to. Through that, we have a sense of their general priorities and their values. And we sort of run campaigns that meet the intersection between our values on the staff and the values of our members. And we have a sense, for example, that our members care deeply about people around the world if they're struck by some kind of disaster. So then the second thing we do is we look for moments of crisis or opportunity when there's something that our members can do to help. And our job, in a sense, is to come up with options, come up with a campaign plan that we then pitch to our members. So when you get an email, most of the time, if you get an email from MoveOn.org, most of the time it's an email that 8 million other people are getting. But every so often, you're getting an email that only 25,000 people are getting. Because every campaign that we run, we first test it to a random sample of our members to find out what the response is. So for example, after a typhoon, if we think what everyone needs to do at this moment is give to Mercy Corps to support what Mercy Corps is doing, we'll send an email to 25,000 people to ask them to donate to Mercy Corps, and we'll see whether they actually click and pull out their credit cards and chip in. And if they don't, that's a signal to us that we haven't found the thing that resonates with our members, and we won't send it to our whole list. We're constantly looking for things that our members want to do, because with 25 staff, there's almost nothing that we can accomplish if we don't have our members behind us. So where we work is the intersection between campaigns and ideas that can actually make a difference, which it's our job to identify, and things that our members want to do, because if they don't want to do it, it doesn't matter how good our idea is. And what that means, in turn, is that in moments of crisis like this, what we're often looking for is the thing that feels like an added value, the thing that other people maybe aren't doing or aren't offering our community an opportunity to do. So after a big natural disaster, there's often a flood of public service announcements, there's ads on TV, and there's billions of dollars that are flowing in to especially the Red Cross, Red Crescent, for example. And at that moment, a few million extra dollars from a MoveOn.org is really a drop in the bucket. It doesn't matter. So that's probably not something that we do. But this scenario reminded me very much of a scenario we actually experienced, which was Cyclone Nargis, which hit Burma back in 2008. So when that happened, there was a different government situation at the time, so it might be different in this context. But at that time, the government of Burma was most concerned about threats to its political dominance, as opposed to the incredible disaster that was unfolding that was affecting its populace. And the government stopped international NGOs from entering the country. There were disaster response teams at airports in Thailand and around the region that were waiting because they couldn't get flight clearance to land in Burma. And at the time, I was working for Avaz.org, which is, at this point, it's, I think, 41 million person, 15 plus language, sort of global online advocacy group. And Avaz had worked pretty closely with some of the monk networks that were opposing the regime in Burma. And after Cyclone Nargis hit, we reached out to the monks that we'd been in touch with, and they said, look, we can buy medicine, we can buy food from local markets. The problem is that no one has any money. And so if you can get us money, we can set up clinics and we can give people food and help them with disaster responses right from our monasteries. But you can't send us money through official channels. We have something called the Handi system, which is like a hand-to-hand delivery system for funds and sort of black market things that is basically monks bringing stuff from monastery to monastery. And they had contacts in Thailand who could smuggle resources in. So they asked us, can you send some money through that? And we recorded a video with a prominent Burmese monk, which my friend Richard's here, you might remember. It was a terrible video. It was on a flip cam. I was editing it on a Mac with a cracked screen. But nonetheless, it sort of made clear that we were responding to an actual request for help. And we emailed our members at Avaz. And then at MoveOn, MoveOn.org members in the US were looking for a way to help. And they saw this message and they tested it to MoveOn members in the US. And there was an incredibly strong response. So what happened was that in the space of, I think, 3 days, Avaz and MoveOn raised, I think, $2 million that we were able to transfer through this informal network to a lot of the monasteries. And what we've heard since is that the monasteries are credited with sharply reducing the mortality that came out of Cyclone Nargis. We heard reports back from some of the monks we were working with that government soldiers would come into the monasteries and they would just hide all the food and medicine in the basement and pretend nothing was happening until the soldiers left. Then they'd leave and they'd take it out and start distributing it again. And that was something that in that moment, any organization that had on-the-ground staff, that had relationships with the local government, that they had to maintain, that had, that essentially was present, actually was much more constrained in their ability to operate. But at the same time, at Avaz or Move On, our staff had no capacity to do anything useful or meaningful. We could only work through partners and allies. And so a lot of what we do at these online groups is look for trusted partners, try to vet them really rigorously, and then when something happens, say, how can we help? And come up with a list of options and then start testing them to our members until we find the thing that connects the need on the ground to the interest that our members have and is something that we can pull off logistically. Now, there's an enormous risk to this, which is that we are small, we are totally generalists, we're multi-issue groups, we have very little issue-specific knowledge, and it's entirely possible that we get it wrong, that we do something that's not helpful or that's actually counterproductive. And so, it's on us to try to get it right, and that means listening as much as we can to as many people as we can, embracing our critics, being curious, doing both appreciative inquiry, but also a lot of skeptical inquiry to find out who's for real and who's not, and then accepting that we're not gonna have a perfect hit rate. But when it does work, it can be really exciting because all of my work and our work is premised on the idea that there are people everywhere who care about people everywhere. And so if you can give them ways that they can help, you can actually unleash a tremendous amount of hope and of productive solidarity that comes from people around the world believing that every human life has tremendous value.
So Move On is good for using the black market. Andrew, actually, well, make your comment and then I'm going to have a question.
Okay, I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that Ben said and didn't say, which I wish I had said. And one is that we can't do what we need to do without money in terms of response. And both of the points I want to make have to do with the incredible importance of mobilizing organizations like Move On, like Greenpeace, like Change.org and others that have this huge list that an organization like Mercy Corps does not have. I'm guessing IMF has a pretty good list. And without that reach into the general public, we are reliant more than we would like to be on what we call institutional donor funding. So that means the US government, the UK government, the European government, the Swedish, the this, the that. Yes, we have foundations that we can reach out to, but in terms of an emergency, all right, so the humanitarian, getting back to our case study, or even addressing the root causes, some of this stuff is you need money like this. So huge digital divide there between an organization like Mercy Corps and Move On, and we would have loved to have had your 8 million subscribers to help support us. The second thing has to do with what you said, Ben, about the monks in Myanmar saying, we have access to food and medicine and whatnot, but we need cash. So this is, again, where the digital divide comes in, because while Mercy Corps does advocacy and tries to influence policy, and certainly that's the team that I lead, and we do our best, but we're for people, right? And we're doing a lot of behind-the-scenes work. We do some public advocacy, but the truth be told, we are, the small fry. And the big players are, sitting here on this stage. They have the megaphone that we would love to have to influence the US government and say, instead of giving money, to ship food over to Myanmar, we need to be doing local regional procurement because, by the way, just because you may have a disaster in Myanmar doesn't mean that the food isn't available another place in the country or the medicine isn't available. This is much faster. We need to be doing more of that. So this is where we could work together. And certainly your platform has tremendous value to moving the needle in places that we would love to impact.
So let me ask, I'm going to turn to Mark since that was a great answer to the question I was going to ask. Mark, I'm going to put you on the spot. What do you need from a Greenpeace or a Move On, and what do you need them not to do?
World Vision and other organizations like World Vision, which would include Mercy Corps and others, we can't do everything. We just can't. And none of the organizations sitting up here can do everything. So we have our niches in terms of what we do well. So I think what we can be looking for are where can we complement each other? Where can we enhance each other's work? And that takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of listening. It doesn't happen just over a cup of coffee. It doesn't just happen after disaster. And I think that those relationships take time in terms of building. Bangladesh is an interesting example. Mercy Corps and World Vision were part of what was called the Emergency Capacity Building Project that was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where we were looking at how do we build our capacity. And we spent years as organizations talking with each other in terms of how are we going to work better. In Bangladesh, that was one of the pilot countries for the ECB. And so there was an awful lot of collaboration that was taking place in advance. That's around traditional delivery of humanitarian aid. I think what we need to start thinking about is breaking outside of the way that we've traditionally thought of delivering aid, and how can we collaborate with other agencies that are innovative, that are coming to this field more recently than we have, but have some wonderful ideas. And again, these are discussions that are going to take time, take commitment to working through the solutions. And the word trust was built. Trust amongst ourselves in terms of do we trust each other with resources, with ideas, with plans, etc. What do we need you not to do? I think there's always going to be points of disagreement. And when it comes time to those points of disagreement, I think we can respectfully disagree. But when disagreements become open to the point that it actually threatens each other's work on the ground or threatens each other's effectiveness, I think that's where we have to be careful. I think there is room for critiquing each other's work respectfully in the right context. To do it in Bangladesh, on the ground at the time, we can do it, but we have to be careful how we do it, because another organization taking a look at what we're doing and offering some very public critique of what we're doing could threaten a lot of really good work. I think there's a time and place for doing some of this, and it may be there, but it may not necessarily be as public. I don't know. But I think there has to be a respect for each other in terms of the work that we're doing. I think the ability to listen to one another, very important. But we even have this discussion within World Vision ourselves in terms of our advocacy team sometimes wanting to take a position on a particular issue that actually threatens operations on the ground. And so we have that tension even within our organization sometimes. A couple of thoughts.
Okay, Ben. If I could pick up on that, one of the things that we've experienced at Avaz and at MoveOn is often we'll be in contact with, say, folks at MSF who will say, someone needs to say this, and we can't say this or have any fingerprints on it.
Yep.
Like this, the government is screwing this thing up.
Right.
We'll be kicked out of the country if we say this publicly. I mean, MSF very often says the things that no one else is willing to say, and then there's some things that even MSF can't say. And at those moments, as an advocacy group that is, our power all comes from being public.
Right.
We're more than delighted to get the message that, hey, this is something we can say,
Right.
because we don't have any staff there. You can't kick us out unless you shut off the internet.
And we often can't say that, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we love having those back channels so we can be your megaphone.
Right.
So let me put a tougher spin on that, though, because you have a small staff, as you mentioned. You're a very nimble organization that spends a lot of time listening to your members and following them.
Yep.
The type of listening that we heard about from the first three speakers is a type that takes a lot of time. It's a lot of time spent in the room. Is MoveOn and Avaz and organizations like that, are you built to be able to be in the room with these sorts of organizations and build that trust with them?
Nope. and it's a big problem. I'll give an example for a not-to-be-named organization in a not-to-be-named country. There was a controversy over the fate of a bunch of land that was really important to a tribal community. And it had been simmering for a long time, and the organization got wind of this and thought, this is something our members care about, this community wants to stay on its land, let's launch a campaign. You know, I think they polled their members of their organization in that country, and they said, yeah, this is great, go for it. They launched a public campaign, bought ads on all the airports, so people coming in and out of the country, saw what the government was going to do to this tribe. And it turned out that there had been a years-long negotiation that had been happening behind the scenes with tribal leaders, with some great, some international partners in the government that was very close to reaching a compromise deal, and it was destroyed by the campaign. Because they didn't know that conversation had been happening. Almost nobody knew it. Most of the people in the tribe didn't know it. And actually, but it had been the result of an enormous amount of trust building. And here this group came in with a kind of hammer of a huge public advocacy thing. That's a big danger, and it's very hard to guard against. I don't have a perfect solution for it except to say that if you're, have the privilege of having a job like mine where you can press a button and email 8 million people, you just constantly have to proceed with humility. Try to second guess, try to figure out who might have some information that would puncture your bubble and call that person before you hit send on that big email. And lose some sleep over the fact that you're not always going to get it right. Like, I think the biggest danger is the hubris that comes from unaccountable power. And digital technology can give communities and individuals a tremendous amount of power, especially for this kind of public advocacy stuff. And often it doesn't have the kind of accountability that it should have. I remember also, like, after the Boston Marathon bombing, the Reddit community did this crowdsourced thing to try to look at surveillance video and figure out who had planted the bomb and named the wrong people. And no one who named the wrong person was accountable for it. It was crowdsourced. That's dangerous. And I think the really key thing is, if you're in a role where you might have some kind of power like this, to just try to keep yourself planted on the ground, try to talk to people that are affected by your work, talk to people who have a lot more experience than you do, and have conversations like the ones we're having on the stage, but also in as many other contexts as possible, so that you don't float out into the cloud, as it were, and think the internet always gets it right.
So that is a good reminder that we have about 8 minutes before our coffee and networking break, because it sounded like one of the answers to that is people like you need to spend more time networking with people
away from the computer
to call. I've got 2 more questions that I want to ask panelists before then. But stay tuned, because we've got about 8 minutes before the coffee and networking break. Blair from Accountability Lab, given that we now have all these new digital tools for listening and also screwing things up, I think the Reddit example is a great example. What does Accountability Lab do around those? Or what do you want to do in order to be able to better deal with all these new digital things that are out there, sometimes helping and sometimes causing problems?
I think we're careful with digital tools. I think often there's a dynamic whereby the tool is the end in itself, rather than a tool to get to something or part of a larger strategy to engage people in the right ways around a challenge. So we're careful with this, and most of what we do is low tech, partly because it also fits the context generally where we're working. And I think there are ways that you can integrate tools that we've heard about. I think in Liberia during the Ebola crisis, for example, the OpenStreetMap team, humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, did some really interesting work gathering information, mapping it, helping citizens report where they were seeing cases of Ebola and that kind of stuff. And of course, that's hugely useful. I would be interested in thinking through how you can make it more of a conversation, how you can, we touched on this a bit, but how you can begin to make that a two-way flow of information in a way that engages people in a process that can build trust, that can lead to larger conversations about the issues, not just immediate response to some of the challenges. And then I think it's a question of thinking about audiences. So we are helping at the moment with the open government process in Liberia, and there's a movement with IBM and some other actors, including iLab in Liberia, to build an open data website. But who's the audience for that? I think there's the government and sort of open data evangelists who can get that data and sort of mash it up and see what they can do with it, which is potentially useful. I think there's the diaspora population who tend to be heavily engaged and online. But then there's Liberian citizens in Liberia, most of whom do not have access to that kind of tool. So how can we then communicate that information in different ways? And I think that's where some of the perhaps more low-tech type tools come in terms of murals. I think we would like to do some really interesting stuff with interactive murals around open budget data in Liberia, using citizen journalists to put out this kind of information in ways that people understand, use the radio, so on and so forth. So it has to be a combination of high and low tech as part of a larger strategy and an ongoing conversation rather than simply a high-tech response to a specific situation.
Great. So I want to end by asking each of you, we're going to go down the line. And Andrew, we're going to start with you again. I feel like since you're on the other end from me, I'm just picking on you a lot. We have noted several times that this is the type of crisis that Groundhog Day style we have seen before, we will see again. What I want to know, and I want you to answer this in 2 or 3 sentences if you can, 1 point each, and then we're all going to have a coffee break. How is responding to this crisis in 2015 different than responding to it in 1995? What changes now that we've broken digital?
I think that as a development and humanitarian organization, we've learned a lot of lessons over the years. I mean, it's an iterative process. So I would say what we're doing differently is we're looking to get at the root causes of the problem, and we're integrating multi-sectors in that, getting to a solution. So it isn't that we're doing an ag program here and we're doing a health or an education. We're looking at layering these programs together because they're complex and the solution needs to capture that.
So learning complexity, sophistication. The differences that we've learned in the past 20 years. Good. Mark.
I would agree. I would also add that, kind of picking up on some of Blair's comments, that in kind of the traditional relief and development organizations, we have learned to be more accountable to those who are intending to serve. The Humanitarian Accountability Partnership was not something that existed in 1995 with respect to being accountable to those who we were attempting to serve. So I would say that that's been a significant development in the last 20 years.
Great. Blair.
Picking up on a variation of that theme, I would say that organizations are realizing that they need to be more internally accountable and walk the talk in terms of what they do. So building systems of culture and a culture of integrity that allows them to show not just the people that they're working with or their donors, but actually people within their network, within the organization, that they are focused on accountability, on the issues that they're talking about, and that they're willing to take steps to prove that in what they do, and work within rules and frameworks that allow for that. I think it's something that I'm seeing evolve, and I'm hoping it in the next 20 years will evolve even further.
Great. Thanks. Michael.
I think the difference now for Greenpeace is that in the past, looking back on our response, you may have seen that Greenpeace was coming off as the hero of the story of the work that we were doing, wherever it is. And I think now the organization in a networked world, in a very different landscape, you would now see local communities and local leaders as the hero of the story after the disaster here, with Greenpeace in a background role, kind of enabling and supporting and,
So appreciative inquiry.
We use appreciative inquiry as a different piece of the process, but yes.
Great. Bobtail.
I think we have the benefit of having a sort of the data available, right? So it's knowledge production that we can ultimately go back to and say, the data is there, what do we learn from this data? And I'm talking about academic data, obviously, in terms of the research that's gone into mapping these kinds of cases and the solutions therein. And I think also social media changes the landscape tremendously in terms of citizens holding up the microscope to not only themselves, but also the people who are supposed to be on the sort of the outside end of responding to these types of crises.
Great. Steve.
There are two drivers here. One is over this time frame. One is probably, hate to sound pessimistic, but a continuing atrophy of governance capacity found in consolidated states because of the pressure from large-scale change, climate change, continued expansion of inequality and wealth, capability to pay for things. So you've got that driver. The other driver is a continued expansion of technologies that allow communities to connect themselves together regardless of what the state looks like. I have in mind things like possibly Google Loon system of connecting people together on a global basis. With that, I would think that you're going to continue to see more and more of the resilience, to use that term, of governance capacity found within the communities themselves, within the NGO community, within community groups that are looking for ways to solve the problems that confront them without hoping that the state is necessarily going to be there for them.
Jason.
Well, obviously the technology differences sort of changed very much. Sort of the monopoly on information that you would have seen in the 1995 in the kind of humanitarian crises we deal with. I don't think that's necessarily changed the fundamental problems we face, which is our political willingness to act. Look at a country like, a situation like Syria, arguably the most documented human suffering in human history. Yet we are worse off than we were 4 years ago in terms of access to the people who are trapped, further probably away than we have to any kind of meaningful solution at a political level, and just continuing sort of absence of willingness amongst many states to sort of engage meaningfully. You can argue the same things played out in the lead up to the Ebola crisis. Again, knowledge of information, not translating into action. And so I think we have to come to grips with that in spite of all the wonderful gains in technology, the ability to sort of shed light on things that are happening and the dynamics within the media world, we're very much still entrenched in a world where political action requires a mobilization of people in power who are willing to do something.
Ben.
20 years ago, organizations like the ones I've been working with didn't exist. And to me, the sort of two aspects of the shift into our existence that I think are notable. One is that, something that you've documented in your research, there was a period in the sort of 70s, 80s, and 90s when a lot of organizations became essentially fundraising direct mail lists where people would write checks or authorize recurring debits from their bank accounts, and that would fund a professional staff that would go off and do things. And the emergence of social media and of digital organizing has created an opportunity for organizations to actually give people the chance to be actors in their own right. And so, in moments like Lenargus that we're talking about, or with Ebola, actually, I'm thinking of what Avaz did. It put out a word to its millions of members asking for volunteers and asked people who were skilled health workers to volunteer for organizations that could train them and connected them to a lot of MSF training programs. Those are the kinds of things that just weren't possible without the emergence of new digital forms. The other thing is that the technology that we use has shaped the kinds of organizations that emerge so that we're not an issue-specific group. And we connect with people on the basis of their kind of general identity as a citizen, as somebody who cares about progressive issues or social justice or the world. And so an organization like Move On or Avaz isn't only springing into action when their kind of disaster happens. In fact, we give people an outlet to take action on a giant range of issues based on the level of opportunity and interest. And so as a citizen, my relationship to the world is now very different. I don't have to join 30 different organizations in order to try to advance 30 different causes. I actually have opportunities every week or two to do something. And this week, I think Syria is a great and heartbreaking example of this. It's been, at Move On, we regularly test messages and campaigning opportunities to our members. People are just shut down. They feel totally powerless about Syria. They don't know what to do. And we haven't found anything that really resonates. Avaz this last week found a beautiful thing, which will not solve the crisis, but is a thing. They realized that in the UK, the government, which has been talking about Syria all the time, has only accepted 143 refugees from Syria. and is actively deporting those 143 people back to the countries that they first arrived in when they escaped from Syria. So Avaaz is organizing their members to pressure local councils, basically city governments, to open up opportunities for Syrian refugees to come to the local cities. And that is a kind of like bottom-up political organizing that is, the strategy is to basically shift the national conversation in the run-up to the national election to pivot the UK's posture in general. And it's a campaign that I think would be really interesting to replicate around the world, basically to move people from despair to thinking this is something we can be responsible for and do something about. And I think that that's kind of a precondition to global action that would have a meaningful effect. So in a sense, I think what the emergence of digital tools has allowed is ways for empathy to be channeled in new ways and ways for creativity to be exercised to find ways to make people agents of change. And the limiting factor a lot of the time is power and creativity. And hopefully all of us together can be creative enough to try to shift power.
Great. So we're going to end this panel here. We're going to take a 20-minute break now for coffee and networking. And then stick around. We're going to come back for a second plenary session where we and our table groups are going to discuss this scenario further. You've heard a lot of different perspectives here on how you could approach this crisis 2 months after the fact, what one can do, and what our various niches are good for. So in your table group, you're going to develop your own strategy there. So that's what we'll be doing after the break, but I think it's time now. Let's thank the panelists, and let's get some coffee and chat.
Are we mic?
So basically, our NGO is similar to MoveOn.org, kind of supporting some digital response to crisis, but it's mostly a humanitarian type NGO. So basically, we're trying to make use of our own networks and also try to mobilize resources, kind of financial resources, and then work with digital response local organizations on the ground so that we give them the financial support. Probably they already have volunteers, they already have limited logistics, but we want them to kind of scale up. So we work and mobilize and get the resources to them on time so that they in turn can use their local network and the limited resources and scale up and be able to give digital response in terms of coordinating health workers, coordinating ambulances, or whatever that particular crisis may be. In this term, the Myanmar crisis. And yeah, so the strategy is basically working with our networks already and then kind of mobilizing resources to get it on the ground on time to local organizations to be able to give direct response to the crisis.
Why did you choose that strategy?
I guess there are good brains on the table, so they already have experiences of these kind of crises in the past, so we just kind of brainstormed and thought that that was the best response.
Panelists we heard from earlier, do any of you have any questions for this group? Why they made the choices they made, why they want to pursue this strategy?
How are you guys going to validate sort of the organizations you try and work with, or sort of understand their capacities to do after you've mobilized the, I guess, financial resources that you potentially would be mobilizing?
Someone want to contribute?
Sure. So one approach
approach that was discussed was relying on other organizations and entities in the space that wouldn't necessarily want money, and so could offer kind of validation and lend credibility to the organizations that potentially would be partnered with.
Okay. So you're going to rely on your networks?
Yes.
Yeah. Let's get one more question from a panelist.
Well, I was on. I was on the panel, so this is cheating. So is Ben. But I thought, in my own perspective, one of the creative tensions that we had on the panel was we were coming to the question with our own set of experiences. So my experience is using technology to mobilize resources in the vicinity to address immediately the problem. So if you lack medical care in a slum, figure out a way of using a cell phone to mobilize the community to get health care, something like that, right? Whereas others were bringing their own experience to the table about how to use a membership list or something to mobilize resources in part to raise funds that then in turn would be shipped to somebody in the area. So those are two different sort of modalities as to how technology will actually come into play in addressing a crisis of this sort. Is that a fair assessment? Yeah. So, you know, it's not that one is better than the other, it's just that it's different, and that might be pulled out as sort of a conclusion or a learned point in this, is that the technology manifests itself in different ways, in different circumstances, with different outcomes.
Thank you. Thanks. And let's ask. Let's hear from the group in the middle now. Who's your spokesperson? All right.
We diverted from the original project, and we're asked to discuss conversations or the panel discussion, and to talk about ideas or talk about how we use technology and how we are using technology now. So you're going to see something completely different here. So. So for a while, I think I had mostly panelists and members of our hosts here, or our hosts. So I think a lot of this came from me chatting with panel members, but it was a great enlightening discussion because we had some good discussion back and forth about, you know, are you bringing your ideas? Are you allowing the people who live in country to come up with their own solutions? It was a theme that was actually brought up before. So anyway, we're sort of related to the project. Areas that we touched on were capacity building, and scalability, using crowdsourcing for solutions in country versus coming with an idea ahead of time. A holistic approach. What are the barriers for that you're taking on? How do you fix it? How long is it going to take? Trying to take those factors into consideration. A lot of that comes from your groundwork. It can't all be done by technology, I don't think. But let's see. Then we talked a little bit about listening. Actually, we talked a lot about listening to those people in country for their own solutions. Accountability and technology we touched on a bit. The technology allows you to present your data and to be more transparent. How to use open information and make it usable in different contexts. That was pertaining again to technology and sending out messages. It's really about messaging, how you may message in differently to different audiences, different countries. Let's see. That I can't read. We again talking about how you're using your information and the messaging can be different for, it could be a generational issue. We were talking about my organization, which has been around for a while. We've used direct marketing for a long time. We're transitioning into technology. The wording, well, actually, we're not transitioning. We've been there for a while. But the wording in our electronic communications is different because because it needs to be. And the turnaround time with technology in terms particularly of fundraising is a lot faster than some of those traditional methods. I hope I've covered most everything. Please tell me please jump in. And then again, when we were talking about messaging, particularly for digital, we talked about, or you all have mentioned, that you're using the technology to either mobilize resources for fundraising. There's multiple reasons for why we may use the technology. We also use it for support, garnering support, having, that was another issue that we kind of went over, and that, when you're doing that messaging, that you need to be culturally sensitive, particularly if you're soliciting ideas from various countries. And vote for favorite.
Oh, that was a small portion.
Just
Okay.
summarize from your perspective. What was your one big takeaway from the conversation?
I would say my big takeaway was listening to your audience, audience might not be the proper word, but listening to those that you're trying to serve to really understand their needs so that you can come in with proper solutions.
And is that listening people on the ground, or is that the people who are on your list?
We were talking about both. In fact, the conversation sort of started with, in a way, that digitally there's more of a one-way communication. And the listening is coming back. And so we used the example of Facebook and Twitter as being sort of technological ways that we can have that back and forth communication.
Any questions or thoughts on the panelists and the team of listening?
Just a piece of the Move On DNA is avoidance of what we call the tyranny of the annoying, which is the widely experienced phenomenon that when there's a group of people talking, the discussion often winds up being dominated by the loudest person or the angriest person. And there's a risk in that in kind of every communications medium, especially social media, and maybe Twitter, second only to YouTube comments. So the one thing I'd offer is to find lots of different ways of listening and appropriately weight comments based on how much they're likely to be dominated by the people who have the strongest opinions as opposed to the most thoughtful thoughts.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Please.
In a society like Bangladesh, one of the challenges is hearing from people who are impacted the most, and that is women and children. And often, to your point, it is going to be men who are speaking up the most, speaking up the loudest, and finding a way to enable the voice of women and children to be heard, I think would be really crucial in this context.
From the round of applause. And let's pass this to the third
Where are
group.
we going? Who's the spokesperson for this group?
Need some leadership.
So we also went a little rogue and more so discussed a lot of the needs and how that might influence some strategies. But then each of those really came up with a set of challenges. So some of the needs and strategies, we discussed having a very regionalized approach and how it's really important to engage a regional, both in the different governments in the different countries because of the environmental response. What else, guys? We also determined that our organization, we were trying to come up with what NGO we would be, that it would be very difficult to have just a short-term or just a long-term approach. That we really needed to have something short-term, but in order to really affect change, it would have to be a long-term approach where there might be more of an advocacy-oriented approach. However, the biggest challenge we came up with that would be funding and keeping that issue relevant and making sure that that garnered support. So that was some of our main ones, I believe. Am I missing anything? And then in terms of additional challenges, lack of ownership, loss of agency, corruption within the government, and again, that regional cooperation we feel is key, but also that poses a number of challenges. So that's something.
Let me again put you on the spot. What was your one big takeaway?
You know, I found it almost frustrating when we do come up with these needs and these challenges, and yet there isn't a clear solution. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's even reflected in the panel discussion. You know, there are so many challenges and there's such great need, but what can we do about it? And I found the comment that I think Ben made about like approaching things with humility, that sometimes we're not going to have the best approach, or identifying these things aren't going to be perfect, but we have to do something. So I think that was my big takeaway from connecting the two.
That reminds me, in the classes that I teach, I always tell them in week 1 that the answer to every question that I ask is, in fact, it's complicated. Mm-hmm. Right. So it sounds like that's the theme of this panel as well. It's complicated. That's great. We have time for one question from a panelist.
So what I was going to say is that what you described there with the short-term needs and long-term needs is really a lot of what we call dual-hatted NGOs, the World Visions, Mercy Corps, CARE, right, others that do that. And the frustration that you were feeling with the solutions being so complicated is really the question that Dave was asking at the very end of our first round, about what are you doing differently now, or what is it? And that's just it, that we've come to realize that the solutions are not going to happen overnight. They're going to take a long time. They're complex, really complex problems that require a very holistic systems approach. And I'm using a word different. It's, you know, resilience, building the ability of communities to recover more quickly, but you need to look at the big picture and not just focus in. So we feel your pain.
Let's give him a round of applause. So as a final activity, was that I don't think that was a work group deal. Good enough though. As a final activity, I want to return to the panelists. We really appreciate you taking your time and coming and joining us today and sharing your experience and your knowledge. And I hope that it's been a generative experience, that interacting with each other, particularly people that you don't always get to sit side by side with in coalitions, has yielded new learnings. We only have time for probably 15 to 30 seconds each, so I'm asking for a short snippet. But I'd like a short snippet of your top takeaway or what you learned today. We're going to start with you this time.
The thing I'm going home with is an excitement about having conversations with people that aren't in the usual Move On Progressive Coalition meetings, because there's often things that are easy for us that are very hard for friends of ours that we'd be delighted to help out with, that we'll never hear about unless we get to know people. And so that goes for my fellow panelists, but also everyone in the room. If we can ever be useful to what you're doing, we have 8 million people, every congressional district in the country, almost every zip code. Some of our members might be able to help you do what you're trying to do, and we'd love to give them the chance to do that.
I think it's just, it's a bit of the last sort of point that was made, is that I think that understanding the complexity of the issues we're dealing with is like a precondition to even beginning to trying to conquer them in any meaningful way, and that there is still very much a struggle, even though the wonderful advances of technology and communication that are supposed to help us understand the complexity of the world, to sort of strike a balance between recognizing complexity and how the technology, and particularly in social media, can sometimes actually eviscerate some of the understanding that complexity and making it too black and white. And so I think, particularly for organizations, we have to kind of find a way to sort of straddle our added values and find ways to work together. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done on that front.
Yeah, another note on the complexity, but I'm a researcher and academic that studies these sorts of things, and I marvel at the fact of how little I know and how much more there is to know. And so just having a chance to listen to the experiences and the points of view of practitioners and handful of fellow academics has really been valuable. I also, since this is the last moment, this sort of got started a couple of years ago in an opportunity that I had to give a talk at Syracuse. I just want to really thank Tosca and congratulate her and Hans and Peg for the great work and all the work that you put into this, and the entire team at Syracuse has really done a great job, and thank you for all of that.
There's an Indian activist by the name of Arundhati Roy who often says that there's no such thing as the voiceless. There's the deliberately silenced and the preferably unheard. And I think one of my takeaways from this particular session is that there's solutions on the ground, and it just means going in with a spirit of collaboration and humility, and you'll hear those solutions. They're there.
Thanks. I think the mix of participants and organizations on this, through this dialogue, has reminded me that we're in a really exciting time, and one where we may be moving away from this whole idea of kind of expert-led, institution-led solutions, but it's clear to me that that the answer is not, to all of our global challenges, is not explicitly only community or individual-led solutions either, that there's a mix and a hybrid out there that we have yet to perfectly define, where we blend new emergent community-led solutions with expertise that has been around for a long time to come up with co-created solutions that bring the best together. And I don't know that we've seen what that exactly looks like perfectly yet, and this reminds me of how much more work we have to do on that.
Thank you. Thank you so much again for having us. It was a fantastic event. I would echo that. I think this isn't about individual fixes. What I come away with is we all have a lot to bring. We all have a lot of ideas. We all have amazing tools, but this has to be about collective solutions to shared problems. It can't be about us doing our own things, because if we do, we'll duplicate each other. We won't coordinate properly, and we'll be less than the sum of our parts. So thank you.
It's one of those situations where I wish I had gone first. So I am also really energized and hopeful. I know we've been talking about the complexity and how tough everything is, but the truth is I think we're at a wonderful moment in time where technology is at such a point, and the expertise, I mean, just listening to my colleagues and the potential that exists for us to do a better job of giving that voice to the voiceless and listening to those ideas and connecting the dots between what each of us is doing, and there are many of us out there, just has me leaving today feeling like, first of all, I'm so glad that I participated, because I have new relationships with people who I think are going to be able to help move us forward and make a difference, which is really what I think we're all trying to do. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Tosca, I want to hand the mic over to you. Final words. And thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So before I say a lot of thank yous to a lot of people, just want to remind you that as Peg Herman, the director of the Moynihan Institute, said at the beginning, this event was one, not just something that we wanted to deliver in order to be helpful to the practitioners in the room, including all of you speakers and all the other practitioners, but it's part of the beginning stage of new research that we are undertaking in the Transnational NGO Initiative around the continuum of traditional, if you will, brick-and-mortar NGOs, if you will, to digitally enabled networks and platforms, and everything that is in between, how they can be complementary. And I think that complementarity was very much emphasized today in the discussions. Something that we will also be interested in, besides complementarity and collaboration, is the issue of to what extent are you also in competition with each other? To what extent are you competing for not just funding resources, but also for media attention, for policymaker attention, and as I think Dave was saying in an email discussion with me, for reputational attention. So there has been an appreciation for the value of discovering each other and finding that we need to be holistic and that everybody is part of the puzzle, needs to be part of the puzzle. But there's also reality that the organizations in the room and that the new emergence of digitally enabled platforms and networks is also a threat to some extent to the brick and mortar organizations in the room, and certainly also there's an element of competition. So in our future research, we want to look at both complementarity and competition, if you will. So you will hear back from us. We want to collate the findings, the takeaways from this afternoon into a short document that we'll share with all of you since you RSVP'd, so we have your email address. So whether you like it or not, some of you have told me that you would like it. We'll send that to you. We want to keep the dialogue going also through our own social media, so you'll hear again from us. And then finally, I want to say a big thank you. This event that indeed started a couple of years ago when Stephen was with us in Syracuse truly was a team effort. And I'm so appreciative for everybody who was part of today. So I want to thank Dave Karp as our moderator. I want to obviously thank all of you as our speakers here, our debaters, if you will. But I want to also give a big thank to our team. So in no particular order, I'd like to Carlo, Erica, will you please stand up? Olga, Ken Harper, Jacqueline, Michael, Hans, where are you? And I want to thank our students back home who stayed back home and worked with our students there. Fiola, Ted, and Shreya. So I want to thank you all. It's been a magnificent team experience, and we hope to be in touch with you. We hope to interview some of you. Let me also make that pitch. And then we'll see you again maybe sometime when we talk about the next stage in this exploration. Thank you. Thanks.